The air left my lungs, so fast it felt like a fist had closed around my ribs. My father's voice cracked across Department 14, under the cold fluorescent lighting, hard enough to make 3 people at the gallery bench look up from their phones. He stood at the polished oak council table in a navy suit that still carried the sharp, chemical scent of dry cleaning, one hand spread flat over a stack of glossy printouts, the other pointing at me like I was something he'd scraped off his shoe. "She stole from her own mother's estate," he said, loud enough for the clerk, the bailiff, the court reporter, and the pair of junior associates behind him to hear every word. My stepmother, Celeste, tightened both hands around a crocodile-textured handbag and lowered her eyes with theatrical grief. My half-brother, Grant, leaned back in his chair with his ankle on his knee, jaw working, smug in that careless way men are when they think consequences are for other people. Their attorney, Martin Kessler, adjusted his silver cuff links and slid the printouts forward one at a time like cards in a magic trick. Across the aisle, a woman from the probate investigator's office paused mid-step, a file tucked against her charcoal blazer, and watched my father perform. The overhead lights made everything too bright. The beige walls, the yellow legal pads, the shine on the mahogany rail. It all looked sterile and official and perfectly designed to make one person feel very small. My name is Vivian Whitmore. I'm 32. And this is the story of how I walked into court alone, let my father laugh at me for having no lawyer, and took back everything he thought he could bury with my mother. By then, Daniel Whitmore had spent 4 months telling anyone who would listen that grief had made me unstable, that I was spiraling, that I was inventing conspiracies because I couldn't accept my mother's death. He said it softly at charity luncheons and firmly in board calls and almost tenderly to mutual friends, which somehow made it uglier. Men like my father never needed to shout to do damage. They used calm the way other people use knives. My mother, Eleanor Whitmore, had been dead for 78 days. She had built Whitmore Civic Group with him from a single title office in Long Beach into a development and philanthropic machine that funded libraries, school arts programs, and affordable housing projects all over Orange County. The public version of my parents' marriage was a magazine spread in cream and gold. The private version was my mother doing the work while my father took the photos. She kept the ledgers in her head, remembered names, knew which mayor needed flattery and which one needed numbers, and could smell a dishonest vendor before contracts hit her desk. My father had charm, posture, and perfect teeth. My mother had substance. When she got sick, the company kept running for exactly one reason. She had trained me to understand its bones. That was what he never forgave. I wasn't supposed to know where the foundation reserves were held. I wasn't supposed to understand the partnership agreements. I definitely wasn't supposed to know the difference between an amended trust schedule and a fabricated one. I was supposed to be his daughter, which in Daniel Whitmore's mind meant decorative, grateful, and quiet. Instead, I stood there in a cream blouse and dark gray suit, with my own binders in my arms and a yellow legal pad under one hand, and let him finish. Martin Kessler cleared his throat and gave the judge's empty bench a respectful glance, as if rehearsing outrage for when it mattered. "We have emails," he told me, "wire approvals, access logs, enough to support removal of you as co-trustee and a referral for criminal review." Grant gave a short laugh and rolled a pen between his fingers. "You should have hired someone, Viv. This is embarrassing." Celeste finally looked at me, the corners of her mouth turned down in a sad little crescent meant for other people. "We wanted to handle this privately." That sentence almost made me smile. Privately was how they had tried to do everything. Private calls, private meetings, private pressure, private offers to step aside for a while, private threats disguised as concern, private family language draped over public theft. I set my binders on the table. Slowly, neatly. The sound they made against the wood was small, but it cut through the room. Then I unscrewed the lid of the water bottle I bought downstairs, took one measured sip, and capped it again. My father watched me with narrowed eyes. He hated pauses he didn't control. "Are you even listening?" he snapped. "Yes," I said evenly. "I'm deciding whether you want to do this in here or under oath." The silence that followed was absolute. It rolled across the courtroom and settled over the room like dust after a collapse. Grant's grin twitched. Kessler's shoulders stiffened. Celeste shifted her handbag from one forearm to the other. My father stared at me for a beat too long, and for the first time that morning I saw it. Not confidence, not anger. Uncertainty. Thin and sudden. A hairline crack in lacquer. He leaned forward, knuckles on the council table. "Do not test me." I looked at the printouts he brought. Then I looked back at him. "Dad," I said quietly, "you already did that." 3 months earlier, I'd been in my mother's dressing room at the house in Newport Coast, kneeling on the pale wool rug in the amber light from a shaded lamp, sorting silk scarves to give to hospice nurses she loved. The room still smelled faintly of her perfume and cedar drawers. Her jewelry case set open on the chaise, untouched. Her side of the closet looked paused, as if she might walk back in and ask me why I was making a mess. That was when I found the envelope that IT had been tucked inside a leather folio behind a row of old tax returns, labeled in my mother's precise block print, "Vivian, if something feels wrong." Inside was a 2-page letter, a photocopy of a trust amendment, and a sticky note with one name on it, Marisol. Marisol Vega had been my father's executive assistant for 11 years. The letter wasn't dramatic. My mother never wasted ink on theatrics. It was concise, practical, and devastating. If Daniel moved quickly after her death, she wrote, it would not be because he was grieving. It would be because he was afraid. The amendment copy attached was not the final document, she noted. If I needed the final version, Marisol would know where the backup file had been stored. She also wrote one line I read 5 times in a row before it sank in. If he tries to make you doubt your memory, trust the documents. My father's favorite tactic had always been scale. He never lied small. He lied in rooms, in systems, in atmospheres. He created versions of reality and then decorated them until everyone inside them forgot there had ever been another one. When I was 16 and caught him shifting foundation reimbursements to cover a failed land option, he told me I was too emotional to understand cash flow. When I was 26 and flagged a contractor inflating invoices, he told the board I had young people's distrust of legacy relationships. When my mother got weaker, he began speaking over both of us with the polished impatience of a man convinced authority was proof of correctness. So I didn't confront him when I found the letter. I called Marisol. She answered on the second ring from a parking lot in Santa Ana, engine idling. I still remember the sound of a turn signal clicking in the background and the way her first words were, "I was wondering when you'd find it." Marisol had that low, steady voice that made panic feel childish. She told me my mother had been worried for almost a year. Not about dying, about timing, about what Daniel would do if she died before some internal transfers and governance changes were finalized. She had prepared redundancies, copies, notes, backups. My mother believed in systems because systems left evidence. "Do not let him know what you have," Marisol said. "He only knows how to win by moving first." That became the first rule of everything that followed. The second rule came 5 days later, when I got an automated alert that someone had accessed my foundation account from an internal desktop at Whitmore Civic Group headquarters after midnight. I was in Pasadena that evening at a bereavement meeting. The access log showed my credentials approving a transfer packet I had never seen. The next morning, when I went into the office and casually asked IT for a routine security report, our network administrator, Ben Chow, looked at the screen a little too long before he spoke. Ben had been loyal to my mother because she was the one who pushed for his promotion when he was 24 and everyone else thought he looked too young to run enterprise systems. "Do you want the official answer?" he asked quietly. "Or the real one?" I told him the real one. He swiveled the monitor toward me and pointed to the line entries. 2 logins under my credentials. One from my laptop. One from a mirrored session originating from an executive office machine. He didn't say my father's name. He didn't have to. The timestamp sat there in black text. Calm and fatal. That was when the panic ended. I know that sounds strange. People think betrayal begins with rage. Mine began with stillness. Once I knew what kind of game he was playing, everything clarified. He wasn't lashing out blindly. He was building a narrative. He intended to remove me as co-trustee of my mother's estate, neutralize me on the board, and route enough money through temporary entities to make recovery messy and expensive. He was counting on grief to keep me disorganized, on family shame to keep me silent, on legal intimidation to make me settle. He also made one critical mistake. He thought I'd react like a daughter. I reacted like Eleanor Whitmore's daughter. Over the next 4 months, I let them think I was unraveling. I missed 2 optional strategy lunches. I stopped correcting Grant in meetings when he misstated reserve figures. I cried exactly once in public, at my mother's memorial, and I knew even then my father would use it as evidence later that I was fragile. I let Celeste wrap both hands around mine in the church vestibule and murmur, "We're all worried about you," with those dry eyes and soft cashmere sleeves. I thanked her. Then I got to work. Ben created mirror logs and off-site backups of every Access event tied to my credentials. Marisol forwarded archived meeting requests, scanned correspondence, and a set of reimbursement approvals Daniel had pushed through during my mother's final hospital stay. I hired a forensic accountant named Naomi Rios for personal estate review, never mentioning litigation. Naomi had sharp black bangs, a voice like frosted glass, and the unnerving habit of smiling when she found something ugly. Within a week, she traced 3 questionable vendor payments from the Whitmore Family Foundation to a consulting company called Northline Civic Solutions, LLC. Northline had a sleek website, a Washington mailing address, and no real employees. Its registered agent was Celeste's brother, Peter Larkin. That was Revelation 1. Revelation 2 came from the metadata on the damning email approvals Kessler would later swagger into court with. They were exported as PDFs from my account, yes, but the underlying routing information showed the approvals had been initiated through delegated admin access created 48 hours after my mother lost consciousness for the last time. The authorization for that delegated access carried Daniel Whitmore's internal executive override. Revelation 3 was the ugliest one. My father had not only tried to reroute charitable funds and remove me from oversight, he had also filed a petition challenging the validity of my mother's final trust amendment, the very document that named me co-trustee and gave me controlling authority over the foundation in the event of financial irregularity. His filing claimed she lacked capacity when she signed it. He filed it 9 days after her funeral. My mother had anticipated that too. Marisol directed me to a backup folder on an old secure drive labeled Eleanor Private. Inside were voice memos, meeting notes, draft governance changes, and a scanned letter from Dr. Anika Bose, my mother's oncologist, affirming that Eleanor was oriented, competent, and making informed decisions on the exact date Daniel now claimed she was confused. My mother had created a paper trail, so clean it gleamed. I didn't send any of it to Kessler. I didn't threaten. I didn't posture. I simply filed my opposition, noticed evidentiary objections, subpoenaed Northline's banking records, and prepared a binder with tab sections in Navy cardstock. If you've never watched wealthy people build a trap for themselves, it is a very specific thing. They cannot resist overperforming certainty. They pile insult onto manipulation because they confuse humiliation with victory. They don't understand that mockery is only power if the other person still needs their approval. The morning of the hearing, I arrived alone. That part offended them more than anything. Not because I lacked counsel, but because it meant I wasn't frightened enough to rent authority. I had consulted Naomi. I had paid for targeted advice on filing requirements and evidentiary procedure. I had spent weeks in the law library downtown under warm brass lamps and among shelves that smelled like paper and dust and old leather, teaching myself exactly how their case would try to move. I knew what I could say, what I could object to, what foundation I needed, and where their timeline broke apart. What I didn't need was someone else to speak for facts I knew better than anyone in the room. My father hated that. After I told him he had already tested me, he laughed once, sharp and brittle. "This isn't a board meeting, Vivian. You can't outstare a petition." "No," I said, "but I can outdocument one." Kessler's eyes narrowed. "Ms. Whitmore, if you intend to make allegations, I'd advise you to retain counsel before embarrassing yourself further." I reached into my binder, slid a single page across the table, and watched him read the heading. Subpoena Response Summary, Northline Civic Solutions, LLC. His face didn't change immediately. Men like Kessler trained their expressions the way politicians trained handshakes. But I saw the exact second his thumb stopped moving along the edge of the paper. Grant leaned over. "What is that?" I answered him, but I kept my eyes on my father. "The vendor your office used to route foundation disbursements. The one registered to Celeste's brother 3 weeks before my mother died." Celeste made a small sound in her throat. Not words, just pressure. Her fingers tightened around the bag handle until the skin at her knuckles went white. "That's absurd," my father said too quickly. "Is it?" I slid a second page out. Bank records. Highlighted lines. Dates. Then a third. IP access logs. Then a fourth. A letter from Dr. Bose. I didn't rush. I turned the pages one by one. Each movement precise. Each sheet aligned with the edge of the table. Deliberate slowness is very hard for liars to withstand. Panic hates rhythm. My father's breathing changed first. Faster. Shallower. Grant dropped his pen. Kessler reached for the stack and nearly knocked over his own legal pad. Celeste looked from the documents to my father, then back again, like a woman standing on a dock and realizing the boat is already left. "This is harassment," Kessler snapped. "No," I said quietly. "Actually, it's charitable fraud." The words landed with the clean force of glass breaking. Grant pushed back from the table, so suddenly his chair legs squealed against the floor. "Dad!" My father didn't look at him. He kept staring at me, and what he was trying to calculate now wasn't whether I had anything. It was how much. How many doors had already opened? How many copies existed? Whether whatever story he told next could outrun documents that had timestamps, signatures, and server logs. "You recorded internal materials," he said. "You accessed privileged. I preserved evidence after unauthorized use of my credentials and after a petition was filed alleging misconduct by me." I replied evenly. "You know that. Martin knows that." Kessler's jaw clenched so hard a muscle fluttered near his temple. I let the implications settle over the room. Then I lifted my water bottle, took another measured sip, and recapped it. When the clerk called the courtroom to order and the side door behind the bench opened, my father leaned toward Kessler so fast his chair nearly tipped. Grant hissed something under his breath. Celeste touched my father's sleeve and he jerked it away. The room had changed temperature. It felt cooler, sharper. The fluorescent lights no longer flattened everything. Now they exposed. We took our places. The judge assigned to the matter was the Honorable Judith Moreno, a former probate litigator with silver hair cut in a severe bob and a reputation for rewarding preparation and punishing theatrics. Her bench was dark wood. Her glasses sat low on her nose. Her expression never fully softened, but I had seen her in prior hearings thank self-represented parties who came in organized. She didn't care about pedigree. She cared about work, which was unfortunate for my father. Kessler rose first and began with all the practiced sorrow of a man billing by the hour. He spoke about family instability and concerning conduct and suspicious transactions attributed to me. He referred to my grief 3 separate times in 6 minutes, which told me he had nothing stronger. Then he turned toward my empty counsel chair with a small flourish. "Your Honor, as the court can see, Ms. Whitmore has elected to appear without counsel in a matter involving complex trust governance and financial misconduct." Before I could stand, my father let out a short laugh and muttered, not quite under his breath, "Because no lawyer would touch this." A few heads turned. The bailiff's expression flattened. Even Kessler seemed to wish he'd kept that one inside the family. Judge Moreno looked over the rim of her glasses. "Mr. Whitmore." My father straightened. "Your Honor, I only mean this is serious litigation, and my daughter appears not to understand." Judge Moreno held up one hand. Then she looked down at the binder stack in front of me, at the index tabs, the highlighted authorities, the witness packets clipped and labeled in matching colors. "I've read Ms. Whitmore's filings," she said. The courtroom went still. She turned one page from her bench notes. Her evidentiary objections were concise, properly supported, and substantially more useful than the court received from your side on at least 2 issues. Kessler opened his mouth, closed it. Then Judge Moreno said the line I can still hear as clearly as if it were happening now. "If Ms. Whitmore has chosen to represent herself, that is her right. And based on what I've reviewed, she's enough." My father's face lost color so quickly it looked as if someone had pulled a shade down behind his skin. Grant stared at the bench. Celeste's lips parted. Somewhere behind me, a chair creaked. I stood, smoothed the front of my jacket. "Thank you, Your Honor." That was the exact moment the power shifted. Not because the judge saved me. She didn't. She simply recognized what was already true. My father had spent my whole life treating credibility like an heirloom passed from men to men, from offices to firms, from firms to judges, from judges to the official version of events. Judge Moreno took one look at the work and broke that chain in public. Then the hearing began. The next 2 hours unfolded with the brutal elegance of a clock. Kessler tried to enter the email printouts first. I objected on foundation and authenticity, then handed up the mirrored access log exhibits showing administrative overlay sessions on the relevant dates. Judge Moreno reviewed them in silence, her finger following the columns. "Mr. Kessler," she said finally, "why do these entries indicate 2 simultaneous environments using Ms. Whitmore's credentials from separate hardware sources?" Kessler adjusted his glasses. "We would need further technical testimony to interpret." "I agree," I said, "which is why I subpoenaed the network administrator and provided notice." Ben Chow walked to the witness stand in a navy tie with tiny gray dots and the expression of a man who had not slept well in weeks. His hands were steady when he was sworn in. That told me he had chosen his side before he entered the room. I questioned him myself, not dramatically, not with television lawyer swagger, just one fact at a time. His role, his responsibilities, the system architecture, the creation of delegated admin access, the internal executive override, the originating machine location, the impossibility of me being the sole actor when the logs showed concurrency from different devices. Ben answered clearly, occasionally glancing at the judge, never once at my father. "Can executive override be created without executive authorization?" I asked. "No. In this case, whose authorization was used?" He inhaled once. "Daniel Whitmore's." Grant made a noise somewhere between a cough and a choke. Celeste sank back in her chair as if the padding had given way beneath her. My father folded his arms so tightly across his chest it looked defensive rather than authoritative. Kessler's cross-examination was frantic and strangely polite, the way a man sounds when he knows aggression will only spotlight desperation. Ben held. He explained log retention policies, mirrored sessions, and access pathways with the patient certainty of someone discussing weather. Facts can be merciless when delivered without emotion. Next came Naomi Rios. She wore a slate blazer, no jewelry except a watch with a black leather band, and carried a banker's box full of ledgers, bank certifications, and corporate registration records. Naomi had the kind of presence that made room-temperature coffee feel formal. She testified to the flow of funds from the Whitmore Family Foundation to Northline Civic Solutions, then to a real estate holding account in Scottsdale connected to Peter Larkin. She laid out the dates in sequence, each one another nail tapping into place. March 12th, Northline formed. March 18th, First Foundation transfer request drafted. March 19th, delegated access added to my credentials. March 24th, my mother admitted for inpatient care. March 27th, second transfer approved under my digital authorization. April 2nd, petition draft challenging my co-trustee authority internally circulated. April 5th, third transfer routed. April 11th, emergency board narrative prepared regarding my erratic conduct. Each date sat in the air a moment before the next one arrived. Not dramatic, not loud, just devastating. Premeditation has a sound when you line it up properly. It is dry, orderly, and impossible to mistake. Kessler tried to suggest Northline provided legitimate strategic services. Naomi smiled. "Please identify the service deliverables," I said. She opened a folder. "There are none. No work product. No project memos. No contract scope beyond generic language. The invoice language is copied nearly verbatim from a previous vendor agreement unrelated to this entity. Can you tell whether that copying was intentional?" She tilted her head. "I can say it was not accidental. It looks like a child tracing a signature through wax paper." That was the first metaphor of the afternoon, and it hit hard enough that even Judge Moreno looked up. My father shifted in his seat. Grant whispered, "This is insane," but no one answered him. Then came the witness no one on their side had anticipated would appear. "Marisol Vega," the clerk called. "If you want to understand arrogance, watch powerful people fail to imagine that the person who booked their flights and printed their briefing packets has been listening all along." Marisol had spent 11 years in the quiet center of my father's empire, absorbing schedules, moods, affairs, lies, donation promises, reimbursement tricks, political favors, and the carefully rationed contempt he showed anyone he believed needed him. She knew which cabinet held the old signature stamp. She knew which donors got their calls returned and which ones got holiday cards instead. She knew when he said, "Circle back," he meant, make it disappear. More importantly, she had loved my mother. Not in some dramatic, secret way. In the way women who survive powerful men together often do. With respect. With gallows humor. With the kind of practical loyalty born from watching another woman carry more than she should. Marisol sat down in the witness chair and folded her hands. Kessler was the first to recover. "Ms. Vega no longer works for Mr. Whitmore, correct?" "Correct. And you are friendly with Ms. Whitmore." "I am. So you're hardly neutral." Marisol looked at him with almost maternal patience. "Mr. Kessler, I worked for Daniel Whitmore for 11 years. Neutrality would have required blindness." Judge Moreno's mouth twitched at one corner. I stepped closer to the lectern. "Ms. Vega, why did you contact me after my mother died?" "Because your mother asked me to if certain things happened." "What things?" "If Daniel tried to remove you from the estate or questioned Eleanor's capacity." "Did he?" "Yes." "When did you first become concerned he intended to do that?" Marisol opened a slim notebook with ribbon dividers. "March 28th. He asked me to pull all draft trust materials except the executed originals, and he asked specifically whether the final amendment naming you co-trustee had been notarized on-site or off-site. He also asked whether Dr. Bose had ever attended signing meetings." The courtroom seemed to tilt for a second. Not physically, morally. A controlled room revealing the shape of premeditation beneath expensive clothes. "Did he tell you why he wanted that information?" I asked. Marisol met my eyes. He said, and I quote, "If she wants a war, I'll make her defend ghosts." My father surged halfway to his feet. "That is a lie." Judge Moreno's voice cut through him like a blade through silk. "Sit down, Mr. Whitmore." He sat. "Did you preserve any written records of these requests?" I asked. Marisol handed over copies of calendar entries, print orders, and a forwarded email chain from my father to Kessler's office attaching a summary titled Vivian Capacity/Control Issues. The subject line still made my skin go cold. Under were talking points. My grief. My supposed volatility. My need for oversight. The strategy wasn't just financial. It was reputational. They intended to make me look incompetent enough that the theft would seem like a consequence rather than a cause. I let the judge read. Then I asked the question that mattered most. "Why are you here, Ms. Vega?" She didn't look at my father. "Because Eleanor Whitmore built that foundation to fund schools and housing, not to pay for Peter Larkin's desert property. And because when Daniel realized someone had to be blamed, he started hinting it could be me. I'm too old to let a man like that use my loyalty as a paper shredder." That was when the fracture really started. Grant leaned toward my father, whispering harshly now, no attempt at discretion. Celeste pulled her hand away when Daniel reached for her. Kessler asked for a recess. Judge Moreno denied it. The courtroom air felt overused, like everyone had breathed the same panic long enough to thin it out. I still had one more thing. The audio file. I hadn't intended to use it unless necessary, because recordings change the temperature of a room instantly. They force everyone to hear tone, not just content. But my father kept shaking his head in that offended, paternal way, as though all of this were one more example of his daughter acting out. I knew that look. I'd watched it bury employees, discredit rivals, and minimize harms until people apologized for being harmed in the first place. So I used it. The recording came from a voicemail my father left Martin Kessler 3 weeks before the petition was filed. He hadn't meant for me to have it. He had left it on the wrong forwarded office line that still routed copies to a shared archival box Marisol oversaw. In it, his voice was low and irritated, stripped of performance. "I don't care if it looks aggressive," he said in the recording. "She doesn't need to lose the whole thing. She just needs to look unstable enough that Moreno takes her out of the driver's seat. Once the audit passes through us, we can clean up the rest. We can clean up the rest. Not we can discover the truth. Not we can protect the estate. Clean up the rest." By the time the audio ended, the silence in Department 14 was so dense it felt structural. Judge Moreno removed her glasses, set them on the bench, and looked down at my father with a kind of measured disgust I will never forget. "You filed a petition alleging misconduct by your daughter while contemporaneously participating in unauthorized access to her credentials And while funds tied to your foundation were moving through a related party's shell entity, she said. Do you understand the seriousness of what this appears to be? Kessler stood. Your Honor, my client invokes. Your client will do what his criminal counsel later advises, Judge Moreno said coolly. For now, we are still in my courtroom. That line hit my father harder than any shout could have. His mouth opened, closed. The man who had always spoken over everyone now looked like he'd forgotten how. The hearing should have ended there, but power rarely leaves politely. It thrashes on the way out. Kessler made a final attempt to discredit me by implying I had engineered the whole thing, that I had baited access, curated documents, manipulated loyal employees, and built a record to seize control of the estate. He wasn't entirely wrong. I had built a record. I just hadn't built the theft. So when he finished, I stood and asked one question. Mr. Kessler, I said, if someone repeatedly enters your home after you discover the first break-in, are you manipulative for installing cameras, or are you prepared? He said nothing. I nodded once. I made sure they found exactly what I wanted them to find after the first unauthorized access. Because once I realized someone was using my credentials, I wanted a complete record. I wanted dates. I wanted devices. I wanted patterns. Most of all, I wanted you to see them. My father stared at me like he'd never met me before. Maybe he hadn't. Judge Moreno continued the matter for sanctions, ordered an immediate forensic freeze on contested accounts, suspended my father's control over foundation disbursements, denied the petition to remove me as co-trustee, and referred the file to the Attorney General's Charitable Trust section for review. Then she suggested, in the driest tone imaginable, that the parties meet in the courthouse mediation suite before the afternoon ended because what remained of the Whitmore matter was no longer a family misunderstanding, but a rapidly expanding liability event. The mediation suite on the fourth floor had leather chairs, a walnut conference table, and windows that looked out over a parking structure so sun-bleached it seemed almost white. The air conditioning was too strong. A tray of untouched coffee sweated beside a stack of paper cups. Hours earlier, my father had entered the courthouse walking half a step ahead of everyone else, chin up, shoulders broad, expensive watch flashing under the lights. By the time he came into that room, he looked smaller. Not physically, structurally, like a building after the first crack becomes visible. Grant refused to sit next to Celeste. Celeste refused to look at Peter Larkin's name in the bank records spread before her. Martin Kessler kept checking his phone, no doubt alerting partners and malpractice carriers in equal measure. My father sat at the head of a table out of habit, then seemed to realize what that implied and moved one chair down. Across from them sat me, Naomi, and a probate mediator named Ellen Sutter, whose calm had probably ended wars smaller than this one. Marisol waited outside unless needed. Ben had already returned to the office under whistleblower protection counsel. I insisted the mediator note on the record. Ellen folded her hands. Here are the options, she said. One path is cooperation, documented restitution, immediate resignations, and an agreed order preserving estate assets while the Attorney General proceeds. The other path is protracted litigation, public filings, likely press interest, parallel regulatory involvement, and discovery broad enough to make today feel nostalgic. Grant swore under his breath. Peter Larkin, who had arrived 10 minutes earlier looking waxy and overconfident, finally spoke up. This is being blown out of proportion. Northline was temporary consulting infrastructure. Naomi slid a packet toward him. Temporary consulting infrastructure does not usually pay the deposit on a Scottsdale holding property. Peter went silent. Celeste turned to my father then, really turned, her body angled away from him as if proximity itself had become risky. You told me it was a tax shelter. That is not what I said. That is exactly what you said. Grant barked out a humorless laugh. Oh, now you're surprised. Celeste's eyes flashed. You signed the second authorization. Because Dad said you reviewed it. I reviewed what he showed me. The fracture widened by the second. Wealthy families in crisis don't explode all at once. They separate along old fault lines. Resentments rise like cracks under paint. Who was favored? Who was protected? Who signed what? Who knew? Who pretended not to know? In that room I watched years of polished family mythology peel away in strips. My father tried one last maneuver. He leaned back, steepled his fingers, and looked at me as if we were back in his office and I was 12. "Vivian," he said, gentling his voice. "This has gone too far. Whatever mistakes were made, we can fix them as a family." That line might have worked on the version of me he'd spent my life expecting. The one trained to equate composure with obedience. The one who mistook his approval for peace. I met his gaze. "You tried to have me declared unfit to manage my own mother's estate. You are emotional. I am precise. You're humiliating us." "No," I said. "I'm documenting you." He looked away first. Ellen Sutter put the settlement terms in front of them one by one. Daniel Whitmore to resign immediately from all fiduciary roles connected to the Eleanor Whitmore Trust and the Whitmore Family Foundation. Grant Whitmore to resign from interim finance authority pending audit. Celeste Whitmore to relinquish any informal signatory access or advisory role tied to family charitable entities. Peter Larkin to consent to full forensic review and asset preservation. Martin Kessler's firm to withdraw from representation in the trust matter and acknowledge receipt of challenged materials subject to further inquiry. Restitution mechanisms. Audit protocols. Non-interference orders. Preservation of electronic devices. Mutual no contact except through designated channels. And one clause I added myself after Naomi raised an eyebrow and the mediator nodded approval. A written acknowledgement that my mother's final trust amendment was valid and had been challenged without evidentiary basis. My father pushed the document back. "I'm not signing a confession." "It isn't a confession," I said quietly. "It's triage." Grant stood abruptly. "I want my own lawyer." "You should get one," I told him. Peter did the same. Celeste started crying then, not elegantly, not strategically. Mascara didn't run because hers was waterproof, but her whole face changed shape with the effort of keeping dignity while fear got there first. And then from the doorway came the final surprise for them. Marisol stepped in with another envelope. "I found this in the off-site archive," she said. Inside was a copy of my mother's handwritten memorandum to the foundation board, sealed and dated 2 weeks before her death, instructing that in the event of any dispute involving Daniel's control over charitable funds, the board should follow my recommendations pending external review because, and I quote, "Vivian sees people clearly when they lie." I did not need the document to win. The judge had already seen enough, but hearing my mother's own words in that room felt like a hand on my shoulder from a place beyond panic. My father stared at the paper as if it had betrayed him too. "Did everyone know except me?" he asked. But he wasn't talking to the room. He was talking to the ruins of his own certainty. "No," I said. "You just never noticed who was paying attention." By 6:30 that evening, the orange light outside the mediation windows had gone copper and thin. The courthouse corridors had quieted. Cleaning crews moved somewhere down the hall with carts that rattled softly over tile. One by one, they signed. Grant first, with an angry slash of ink. Peter second, his signature trembling. Celeste third, staring at the clause about non-interference, so long I wondered if she had ever really read anything before signing it. Then Martin, under protest language, drafted to save whatever was left of his professional dignity. My father signed last. "Please subscribe my channel." He held the pen away. He held everything when he believed force could substitute for control. Too tight, too performative. He read only enough to remind himself he hated every line. Then he wrote his name across the paper he had spent months trying to keep me from ever putting in front of him. When he finished, he set the pen down with a soft click and looked at me. "You think this makes you powerful?" I gathered my copies, aligned the pages, and slid them into my binder. "No," I said. "I think this makes me accurate." He flinched as if I'd struck him. At the door, I turned back once. Not for drama, just for closure. He had always loved saying one sentence when he wanted to end arguments in my childhood. "This family survives because I know how to make hard decisions." So I handed it back to him. "You were right about one thing," I said evenly. "This family survived because someone knew how to make hard decisions. It just wasn't you." Then I left him under courthouse lighting that made everyone look honest. The next few weeks were administrative and brutal and strangely peaceful. Once truth enters the official record, emotion loses a lot of its leverage. Auditors arrived. Preservation notices went out. External counsel took over for the foundation. The Attorney General's office requested documents. Reporters began circling after a leaked mention of related party charitable transfers, though the real details stayed sealed long enough for the board to act. I moved out of the Newport Coast house before the month ended. My new apartment was in Corona del Mar, on a quiet street lined with jacaranda trees, with pale oak floors, white walls, brushed brass fixtures, and a narrow balcony that caught morning sun. The first Saturday there, I woke before 7, padded barefoot across cool tile, and made coffee in a kitchen that had never heard my father's voice. The light came in soft and gold through linen curtains. Outside, someone was walking a dog. A gull cried somewhere over the water. I stood at the counter with both hands around a warm mug and realized my body had stopped bracing for impact. Fresh starts rarely announce themselves. They arrive as ordinary peace. By then, the karmic ledger had begun to balance. My father lost his board positions first. Quietly at first, then all at once. 3 outside nonprofit boards requested temporary leave pending review, and 2 never invited him back. His country club friends, men who had loved his sponsorship dinners and his donor tables, suddenly developed scheduling conflicts. An industry magazine that had once profiled him as a civic patriarch ran a shorter, colder piece 3 months later about governance failures and family foundations. They used his name only twice. That probably hurt him more than a scandal spread would have. My father had always feared diminishment more than disgrace. Disgrace still acknowledged scale. Diminishment made a man ordinary. Celeste received the social punishment she had spent her whole adult life trying to avoid. Not criminal, not financial, at least not at first. Social. The women who had floated around her at luncheons in cream silk and diamonds suddenly remembered other seats to take. Invitations thinned, then stopped. The gala circuit, which had once treated her like a decorative extension of Daniel's importance, rediscovered the meaning of discretion. She wasn't cut out for isolation. People like Celeste mistake adjacency for identity, and when the first is stripped away, the second has nowhere to stand. By winter she had filed for divorce, citing financial misrepresentation and emotional distress. Her attorney's language was expensive and useless. The irony was almost elegant. Grant's consequence was smaller in headline and larger in spirit. He had built his entire personality around being the inevitable son, the one who would inherit not just money but gravity. Once the audit showed he had signed disbursement packets he never read and repeated numbers he never verified, the legend collapsed. He wasn't a mastermind. He was worse. He was careless. Carelessness is hard to rehabilitate in finance. A private equity role he'd been courting evaporated. His interim authority ended. The board offered him a consulting exit package that would have been generous if it weren't so humiliating. Last I heard, he was trying to reposition himself in Phoenix under a title vague enough to survive Google. Peter Larkin faced what he should have feared all along, documentation. The Scottsdale property tied to Northline got frozen. His little consulting infrastructure disappeared under subpoenas and certified records. Men like Peter survive by staying just small enough that bigger men treat them as useful shadows. Once daylight hits, they dissolve fast. Martin Kessler didn't lose his license, at least not immediately. The world protects polished men longer than it should, but he did lose clients, internal standing, and whatever smug invulnerability he'd been wearing like cologne. His firm withdrew from several trust matters after conflict reviews widened. One partner I'd met years earlier at a holiday dinner sent Naomi a message that simply read, "Catastrophic judgment." That felt about right. And my father called. Of course he did. The messages came first from blocked numbers, then from an assistant I didn't know, then from his own phone once pride gave way to necessity. Some were angry. "You've made a private matter public." Some were strategic. "We should discuss a unified statement." Some were almost tender in that counterfeit way he used when he wanted access to the past without accountability for it. "I miss my daughter. Your mother would hate this. The family isn't the same." That last one sat on my screen one rainy Tuesday morning while I was eating toast over audit summaries. I archived it without responding. That became my practice. Not deleting, archiving, preserving. I had learned too much to erase evidence out of discomfort. Silence, I discovered, can be both shield and verdict. My life did not become glamorous after that. It became mine. The skills I used to survive him turned out to be marketable in a world full of women who had been underestimated by family money and procedural intimidation. It started accidentally. Naomi referred a woman to me whose brothers were trying to edge her out of a commercial property trust after their father died. Then Marisol asked if I'd speak to a friend dealing with estate confusion, which turned out to mean forged caregiver invoices and an uncle who thought volume could replace law. I didn't become a lawyer. I didn't want to. But I built something adjacent and sharper, a boutique case strategy firm for probate and fiduciary abuse victims, specializing in document organization, timeline reconstruction, evidentiary preparation, and institutional navigation. We called it Clear Ledger. Naomi joined as a partner on the financial review side. Marisol ran operations with the serene efficiency of a woman who had already survived worse than startup chaos. We took a small office in Irvine with glass-front conference rooms, matte black fixtures, and shelves lined with binders in colors that made clients exhale the moment they saw them. Clean labels, clear dates, proper records. Order is a kindness when someone else has been trying to drown you in confusion. One afternoon about 6 months after the hearing, I was at my desk under warm recessed lighting, sorting intake documents, when Marisol appeared in my doorway with 2 coffees and the look she got when gossip and justice happened to overlap. "You won't believe who I just saw," she said. "Who?" "Grant, at a networking breakfast in Costa Mesa. He introduced himself as an independent restructuring consultant." I looked up. He used the word independent. She nodded solemnly. "Twice." I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my coffee. She set the cup down on a cork coaster and leaned against the doorframe. "He also asked whether you were still angry. Were you kind?" I was accurate. That made me laugh again. Another karma update came from Dr. Bose, of all people, whom I met for tea months later near Hoag Hospital to thank her for the capacity letter that had helped dismantle my father's petition. We sat outside under striped awnings with porcelain cups, warming our hands while late afternoon light turned the sidewalk honey-colored. She stirred her tea once and said almost casually, "Your father requested copies of Eleanor's care notes through a new attorney. The hospital denied the overbroad request." I raised an eyebrow. "He appeared personally for the records consult," she added. "He seemed diminished." The word hung there between us, precise as a pin. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. There is a difference between wanting someone to suffer and no longer volunteering to carry them. Some things did survive the fire. My friendship with Naomi deepened into something that felt less like professional alliance and more like chosen family built on competence and dark humor. Marisol became the aunt I had never formally claimed but always needed. Ben eventually joined an independent cybersecurity firm after leaving Whitmore Civic Group, and once every few months he came by our office with pastries and new horror stories about executives who thought deleting emails counted as strategy. And then there was Lila. Lila Mercer was Celeste's daughter from her first marriage. She was 24, all sharp cheekbones and blunt honesty, and for the first few years I knew her, we occupied the same rooms with the careful politeness of women drafted into a family neither of us had designed. During the worst of it, she stayed out of public view. I assumed that meant allegiance. I was wrong. 7 months after the hearing, she asked if I would meet her at a small cafe in Laguna, a place with terrazzo floors, green banquettes, and windows full of sea light. She arrived in a denim jacket, no makeup, hair tied back, looking younger than I remembered and far less armored. "I owe you an apology," she said after we ordered. "For what?" "For not warning you earlier. I thought if I kept my distance, I wasn't participating. Turns out distance is just prettier cowardice." I studied her for a second. There was no performance in it. No inherited manipulation. Just an uncomfortable truth, offered without garnish. "So why now?" She looked down at her cup. "Because my mom moved into my apartment for 3 weeks and cried every night about the life she thought she had, and I realized everybody around your father keeps learning too late that proximity isn't protection." She glanced up. "And because your mom was kind to me when she never had to be." That landed somewhere deep. We talked for 2 hours. About my mother. About the weird architecture of blended families built around charismatic men. About the luxury of pretending not to see what benefits you. About shame. About how women are so often trained to confuse endurance with virtue. It was one of the easiest hard conversations I had ever had. After that, Lila and I developed the kind of unlikely friendship only truth can make possible. Not instant sisterhood, something better. Honest affection, slowly earned. She sent me articles on coercive control, and I sent her contractor recommendations when she moved. She came to our office launch party wearing a navy dress and brought a bottle of champagne with a note that read, "For clean records and cleaner exits." By the time a year had passed, the Whitmore name no longer felt like a structure I lived inside. It felt like a file I had closed. That evening, on the anniversary of the hearing, I stood on my balcony with a glass of sparkling water while the sun went down over the coast. The sky was all apricot and amber, the kind of orange glow that turns windows into mirrors and makes the city look gentler than it is. Down on the street, headlights began to blink on one by one. The air carried salt and jasmine from somewhere below. Inside, the apartment glowed warm against the deepening blue, books on the shelves, a throw folded over the couch, my life arranged by choice rather than inheritance. Lila was there, leaning against the balcony rail in a soft gray sweater, holding her own glass. Naomi sat cross-legged on the outdoor chair scrolling through photos from a client's courthouse victory earlier that day. Marisol was inside plating olives and cheese as if hospitality were a ceremonial art. The whole scene felt improbable in the quietest, most satisfying way. Not triumphant like a movie ending. Truer than that. Less loud. More earned. Lila lifted her glass toward me. "To your mother," she said. I touched mine lightly to hers. "To women who leave instructions." Naomi laughed from her chair. "And to color-coded exhibits." "To color-coded exhibits," Marisol echoed from inside. We drank. For a moment, the last light caught the rim of Lila's glass and threw a thin golden line across her wrist. It reminded me how strange healing can be. Sometimes it arrives dressed as justice, sometimes as paperwork, sometimes as coffee in a new kitchen, and sometimes it arrives as warmth from someone who once sat on the wrong side of the room and chose, eventually, to walk across it. I thought then about the woman I had been before all of this. Not weak, just still negotiating with the hope that love and honesty would be enough to stop a person committed to power. I thought about how long I had confused being reasonable with being safe. How often I had trimmed my own clarity to preserve someone else's comfort. I don't blame that version of me. She was doing what girls are taught to do in beautiful houses with expensive silence. She was surviving, but she was waiting for permission that was never coming. The woman I became does not wait that way anymore. I am not harder now in the way people mean when they talk about damage. I am clearer. There is a difference. Damage closes. Clarity opens. I laugh more than I used to. I trust slower but better. I leave faster. I document sooner. I no longer spend my intelligence translating disrespect into something easier to carry. And perhaps most importantly, I have stopped confusing a shared last name with shared values. Sometimes, very quietly, I thank my father for that. Not aloud. Not to him. Not because what he did was forgivable in some sentimental way. It wasn't. But because he forced a transformation he never intended. He tried to corner me into shrinking, and instead he introduced me to the full weight of my own mind. He mocked me for standing alone, and in doing so, he stripped away every illusion I had left about who I needed beside me in order to be formidable. The city lights came on below us, scattered and bright. Lila nudged my shoulder. "You're doing that thing." "What thing?" "The faraway look," she said. "The one that means you're writing a verdict in your head." I smiled. "Maybe just a summary." "Is it a good one?" I looked out at the horizon, where the last line of sun hovered briefly before slipping away. "It's accurate." She laughed, and we clinked our glasses once more. "If there is a moral to any of this, it isn't that revenge is sweet or that justice always arrives on time. It's that composure can be a weapon when truth is on your side, and preparation can sound, to the guilty, exactly like thunder. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about making someone hurt the way you hurt. It's about becoming so clear, so steady, and so undeniable that their version of you can never survive again. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about destroying them. It's about building yourself so completely that when they finally look up, all they can see is what they failed to bury.